These folks shared really this oppositional view of Ghana, of a black radical formation, and of this view of African American citizenship, in which they maintained a stake in the U.S. black freedom movement while they advocated solidarity with the liberation struggles of African peoples as well. Now, lest one draw the conclusion that this oppositional vision of African American citizenship was so radical as to be unrepresentative of the mainstream of black leadership, ironically, this engagement with Africa, this view of African American citizenship as invested in U.S. policy towards Africa and the fate of these liberation struggles, was embraced also by establishment civil rights leaders as well. And I think Mary's work on Thurgood Marshall certainly shows this. But I have another example of this phenomenon of the civil rights, African American establishment's engagement with Ghana. That embrace by civil rights liberals and the negative official response to it really points to this vexed political matter of African American civic identification, loyalty, and citizenship in the 1960s. And this is long after the Cold War repression of the 1950s. In the aftermath of the UN demonstration, which just sort of hovers over much of what happens in terms of U.S. engagement with Africa in the decade, U.S. officials hoped to prevent future protests of this sort. And so it was the State Department officials cultivated closer ties with African American civil rights leaders. And Mary pointed out how the Birmingham crisis was a major occasion for this. And so they sought to encourage the State Department what it considered a more responsible black involvement in African affairs. And so in 1963, in addition to the State Department sending African American speakers to overseas to talk about, to sort of complicate the issue of violence and unrest in the United States by talking about our federal system, an organization called the American Negro Leadership Committee on Africa was born of an alliance between U.S. foreign policymakers and prominent civil rights leaders, including King, A. Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, James Farmer, and Dorothy Height. And while organized under the supportive aegis of pro-civil rights liberals in the State Department, this organization fared badly when it later attempted to lobby the Johnson administration on its policy toward the Congo and Africa in late 1964. High-level officials in the Johnson administration rejected this attempt by civil rights leaders to influence U.S. foreign policy. President Johnson believed that African American civil rights leaders should be grateful for civil rights and voting rights legislation and were thus not entitled to an independent critique of U.S. foreign policy. And it's worth recalling in this context that King earned the condemnation of Johnson and even many African American civil rights leaders when he declared his opposition to the Vietnam War in 1967. Now, Malcolm X shared the Expatriates' criticism of the dubious role of U.S. power in the world, and you may recall that Malcolm had invoked Lumumba's death in part of his explosive argument that Kennedy's assassination represented the blowback of the administration's tolerance of violence to achieve its foreign policy objectives. And after his departure from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm, as you all know, tried to reinvent himself through his travels throughout the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. And Malcolm was invited to Ghana by the Black American Expatriates. He was warmly received by them and members of the diplomatic corps in Ghana, although Kwame Nkrumah didn't want to be seen with him publicly because of a lot of pressure from U.S. Embassy and State Department. With the group of secular black progressives, activists, and former Muslims who followed him out of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm founded the Organization of Afro-American Unity in Harlem, which was inspired by the Organization of African Unity, whose summit meeting Malcolm had addressed in Cairo in 1964. And Malcolm had appealed for the support of African heads of state as part of a plan to charge the United States with violation of human rights, the human rights of African Americans. He never got a chance, obviously, to do that, but Malcolm's travels hint at the potential global culture of opposition among Africans on the continent and black peoples in the diaspora. Now, weeks before his death, Malcolm had advised Afro-Americans to return spiritually, culturally, and philosophically to Africa, not physically. And this statement was Malcolm's rejoinder to this ongoing struggle over the terms of African-American identification and political consciousness. And Malcolm and his followers insisted on the legitimacy of black and African heritage as the basis for full participation in American life. And so this is a really interesting moment, an oppositional naming of the Afro-American. And this was a defiant assertion of the expansiveness of blackness as an indispensable grounding for national belonging and for international affiliation, and ultimately for a radical democratic politics that's really universal in its applicability. And so in practical terms, Afro-American entailed an obligation, a sense of obligation to engage issues of U.S. foreign policy alongside the local concerns of Afro-Americans. And speaking of the Afro-American, Malcolm has signaled anew the importance of being black and American, with no contradiction between the two. And if you remember the eulogy of Malcolm by Ossie Davis, Davis stressed the importance of the term Afro-American. And to quote Davis's eulogy, Malcolm had stopped being a Negro years ago. Malcolm had become an Afro-American, and he wanted so desperately that all of his people would become Afro-Americans too. Now, there's a lot of political meaning in that, condensed in that sentence and in that term, Afro-American, and I think it's something that's easy to sort of lose track of or to forget, but it really captures the moment. Now, I'm just going to wrap up and say that it's really understandable that the events of 1968, in which historical time itself seemed to accelerate, would eclipse much of what preceded it in our memory. But however, I would argue that the crisis of the legitimacy of U.S. power and authority sparked by the events of 1968 was not obviously the first time that there had been that kind of crisis of legitimacy. In any case, the crisis of American legitimacy was deeply apparent to African-American expatriates in Ghana and their allies in the U.S. as early as 1961. From 1963 onward, when the phrase "long hot summer" became synonymous with widespread fears that civil rights demonstrations by blacks would erupt into violent upheavals, movement activists in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and northern-based spokespersons like Malcolm X were noting with increasing frustration the limitations of an advocacy of nonviolence when violence seemed to be monopolized by white supremacists with the complicity of the federal government, and violence was also central to U.S. foreign policy. Viewed in this context, the events of 1968 are less of an aberration or even a watershed than an expression of a level of violence that was endemic in American society during the 1960s. To investigate the origins of that violence in the 1960s is a subject well worth further exploration. Thank you.